This video is about
American history.
the War of 1812 is often lost in the shuffle of armed conflicts in American history. With two world wars, the American Revolution, and Vietnam in the mix, the War of 1812 struggles to remain in the public consciousness. The irony is that the War of 1812 has left indelible marks on the United States. This short video will attempt to identify some of those marks. I like to call this presentation Echoes of the Past. Let's start with an overview of the battles. This informative map shows us the British blockade of the United States along the Atlantic seaboard and in the Gulf of Mexico. It also shows us where some of the major battles of the war took place. There are some very famous, if you're Canadian, and infamous, if you're American, episodes during this war. For example, in the opening months of the war, General Hull surrendered Fort Detroit to Sir Isaac Brock in Tecumseh, in part because Brock wrote a letter to the American commander saying that he wouldn't be able to control the First Nations warriors when the battle started. Among the people living at Fort Detroit at the time were Hull's daughter and grandson, and this concerned him very much. A couple days after the letter, and after witnessing a couple more psych-outs that General Brock and Tecumseh organized, Hull surrendered the fort in its entirety. Please notice how much military action takes place in what is now Southwestern Ontario. On the Canadian side of the border, this was the most fertile land and was the most densely populated portion of the British North American colonies. You can pause the video to inspect the notations on this map if you wish. Hopefully you noticed that the Battle of York is shown as an American victory. When the American forces captured the young city of York, American soldiers set fire to the legislative buildings in town. They also plundered the homes of individual citizens. This event is the pretext for our first echo of the past. One part of the British strategy during the War of 1812 was to take advantage of their superiority at sea. Small armies of troops were loaded onto British ships like these that traveled up and down the Atlantic seaboard. At different points along the coast, the British soldiers would land and then attack whatever was around. Their orders were to attack whatever they found, but not to take control of any territory. The strategy was to harass and confuse the American army. In August 1814, one of those small British armies was sailed into Chesapeake Bay, and their target was Washington, D.C. This British army defeated a small American force defending the city, and then they marched to Washington. British soldiers went into the Capitol building and held a mock session of Congress where they voted to burn the building down. After setting fire to the building, they walked to the residence of the President of the United States. There they found that a dinner had been prepared and served, and then abandoned when news came that the British were coming. The soldiers ate the meal, and after looting the residence, they set fire to the building. There are two especially memorable things about this event. The first is that James Madison's wife, Dolly, was one of the last to leave the White House. The president had left hours earlier to round up some troops and figure out how to keep the U.S. government functioning. Dolly Madison stayed and determined what items were to be left in the White House and which ones would be taken to safety. Her famous decision, or her most famous decision, was to keep this portrait of George Washington. It is a very famous portrait of the first President of the United States, and in fact you can see it today in the National Portrait Gallery in Washington, D.C. Mrs. Madison considered the portrait to be too valuable a national symbol to leave behind, and so she ordered it packed up with other materials or other items from the White House. The second echo of the past is that the President's home was not destroyed by the fire. In fact, shortly after the fire was set, there was a heavy downpour that doused the flames. When the war was over, a decision was made to repair the residence as best could be done and paint over any signs of the burning or charring with white paint. This caused the President's residence to be called the White House. This is an engraving of the White House from 1820. The next echo of the past is another national symbol, but of the musical variety. After the British set fire to Washington, their orders were to continue up the Chesapeake Bay and attack Baltimore, north of the American capital. On the water approach to Baltimore, the British Navy had to pass Fort McHenry, which is located here in this print. The British bombarded the fort for 24 hours, but the fort didn't surrender and the British ran out of ammunition, so they called off the attack on Baltimore. The echo of the past is that a man named Francis Scott Key witnessed this bombardment. Key was a lawyer who had come to the British fleet to negotiate the release of a good friend of his, Dr. Beans, who was being held aboard a British ship. When the negotiation was complete, Key and Beans were not allowed to leave the ship because the British officers felt that they knew the strength of the British force and they knew that Baltimore was the target. The British planned to hold the Americans aboard ship for the duration of the campaign against Baltimore. When it was over, they would be released. In a gesture that was meant to humiliate the Americans, the British captain allowed his temporary prisoners to watch their countrymen at Fort McHenry be crushed. From 6 in the morning on September 13th to 6 in the morning on September 14th, the British fleet rained cannonballs and rockets on the American fort. That second morning, Francis Scott Key and Dr. Beans were elated to see that their flag was still there. When the British fleet decided to abandon the attack, they released the American prisoners. As Key returned home, he was so moved by the sight of the flag that he began to compose a poem. As Key returned home, he was so moved by the sight of the flag that he began to compose a poem. That poem, about a star-spangled banner, and you can see a picture of just how big and tattered it was. This is the original flag, photographed in 1912. This poem about a star-spangled banner, surviving the rocket's red glare and bombs bursting in air, to be seen by the dawn's early light, became the American national anthem. Our final echo of the past comes from the most futile but most meaningful battle of the entire war. The Treaty of Ghent ended the War of 1812 on Christmas Eve, 1814. Because there were no cell phones or landlines or telegraph machines, word about the peace treaty did not arrive in North America until the middle of February. Because of this delay, a few battles happened after the war was technically over. On January 8, 1815, a force of 8,000 British soldiers attacked the dug-in position of 5,400 Americans. The Americans were led by a guy named Andrew Jackson. Maybe you've heard of him. This drawing identifies a few things of importance, but I would like to draw your attention to the staggering difference between the casualties suffered by the British Army in comparison to its original numbers, and the American Army, 333 casualties, in relation to its numbers. I'd like you to consider the scale of those casualties in addition to the amount of time that the battle took. This victory was enormous for the American psyche. The country had been humiliated at Detroit and again at Washington. This victory became what Americans focused on when they thought about the War of 1812, because it was the most one-sided victory they had won. It also made Andrew Jackson a household name across the country, which didn't hurt his chances when he decided to run for President of the United States a little later in his life. The other way that this stunning victory echoes through the past is that the Battle of New Orleans came rushing back to American consciousness in the summer of 1959 when this song rose to #1 on the pop charts and stayed there for 6 weeks. Please click on the link provided and enjoy a trip back in time to 1959. I hope you enjoyed that musical interlude. That concludes our exploration of some of the War of 1812's echoes of the past. Although who won the war remains a topic of interest for basically military historians, the War of 1812 has faded from public memory. Hopefully this presentation has convinced you that while the war may be forgotten, its experiences and its results continue to reverberate to this very day. The next time you watch a professional sporting event or the United States wins an Olympic gold medal and the Star-Spangled Banner starts to play, you will have a nice fun fact for the person beside you when the anthem is over. Thank you very much for watching this video about
American history.